Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries with John and Hannah.
Hi.
And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing those devilish shape changers, the Barghests. Okay, so as I've said, we're going to be looking at the Barghest, which is a sort of goblin/wolf shape changer in D&D, which first appeared, to the best of our knowledge, in the AD&D Monster Manual 2. So I can see you've got that there, love. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, so first thing that I noticed when I look at this page is how ape-like the picture of the Barghest is.
Okay.
It just looks like a baboon holding a rock.
Yeah, it does a bit, actually, yeah.
But it's interesting because I remember the artwork from the third ed one particularly being quite striking, and it's such a different creature here.
Yeah, because it's more wolf-like in the third artwork, as far as I remember, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. So, they come from the plains of Gehenna.
Yep.
They spawn their litters into the material plane, and then the whelps run around the material plane, being sort of demigods to goblins.
Okay.
Turning into dog things, which are sometimes known as devil dogs, and generally trying to eat enough hit points worth of... enough character levels worth of players or NPCs.
Yeah.
To be big enough to get back to Gehenna.
So I presume they sort of gain extra hit dice or whatever as they eat people.
There's quite a convoluted description, but what it basically comes down to is for every level worth of characters they can eat, they get a hit point.
Do you mean hit dice?
For every 8 levels, they get a hit dice.
I see. So they have to really sort of work at it to actually get that hit dice, and they can't just like nom on a low level character. A
0 level character gives them half an energy level, it's described as. So they need to kill 2 0 level characters to get 1 hit point. So 16 to get 1 hit dice.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, obviously here they're equating these like energy levels, the character levels, which as we know are purely a sort of out of character sort of game artifice, but if they're equating them as somehow being like the energy or the resonance or whatever that the Barghests are absorbing to make themselves more powerful, it makes sense. Like your average like butcher or baker or candlestick maker in like a village isn't going to have as much of it as like your 10th level warrior who's been like slogging his way through the dungeons of hell for however long.
Mm-hmm. It's also quite a nice way to have the monster get bigger and scarier each time you face it.
Yeah.
Because it's potentially killed a player character and you can have it take out a few NPCs in between. Yeah,
and obviously we know from the sort of monster advancement rules that when you go up in hit dice, that has like a knock-on effect on like your attack modifiers and stuff like that. So it's not just going to become like an increasing bag of hit points with the same stats. But like you say, that does add an interesting sort of time element on it, because if you hear like, oh, this Barghests like preying on the people around this area, and you don't stop it, when you eventually do get round to it, it's probably going to be a more difficult threat because it's going to have eaten all these people. I mean, like you say, it takes twice as many 0 level characters to go up, but if your Barghests at like an entire village with like 40 people in it, that's still a lot of hit points and potentially hit dice that it can have gained. So I like the fact there's a nice sort of time element in it there.
So we also get the spell list that it can do, which is shape change from canine to goblin-like form, change self, levitation, misdirection, projected image, and once per day it can use charm, person or monster, dimension door, and emotion.
So it can manipulate its prey like with illusions and affect their minds and stuff like that, presumably to make them easier to pick off.
So then we get a quick bit about how its movement changes when it's in its canine form. And then we get on to the weakness.
Okay.
So, if in their canine form they take the risk of failing to save versus magical fire attacks, they can get hurled back to their own plane. And if they get sent back there when they're not big enough,
Yeah.
they just get eaten by the other Barghests.
Because they've failed their task.
Pretty much.
Makes sense.
And they're unlikely to be able to get back to the prime material plane afterwards. And then the last bit, which just made me smile, is the description where it talks about the colour of the creature. And it says, it starts off yellow, and then as it gets larger and stronger, it goes from yellow toward a bluish red.
So purple. Okay.
There's even a double space there. There's obviously been some editing shenanigans gone on in that particular description, and it just made me smile.
I suppose maybe they could mean, you know, sort of like, I don't know, like the blue-red of like a bruise or something like that, you know, rather than like just a purple. But yeah, so it's an odd turn of phrase.
Yeah, and then as an adult, they're normally blue. The canine form is any typical large dog, and almost impossible to tell from a normal dog, although the dogs will be able to tell them apart.
That makes sense. Okay.
So what about Second Ed?
So in Second Ed, they actually appeared in the Planescape campaign setting, monstrous sort of like edition, and makes sense because they're from Gehenna. Obviously, Planescape is all about the different planes. Mm-hmm. We get a nice bit of Tony DiTerlizzi's art in this, which is very striking, and it shows this sort of bluish, gnarled, miserable-looking goblin creature with like two wolves sort of running next to it. The stats are fairly similar. You get some additional stats for like the different hit dice levels. They're described as inhabiting the plains of Gehenna. Their natural shape's very much like that of a large goblin, and they generally keep that form when they're amongst other goblins. Again, it describes this change of colour as they go from whelp to sort of being full grown. It says when it's a whelp, its skin changes from yellow to, again, this bluish red colour. Eventually, its skin turns a more sort of even dark blue colour at adulthood.
Although I can't help but notice that the artwork has chosen to interpret that as green.
Well, I wouldn't say it was really green. I would say it was a sort of bluish colour, but it can assume at will the form of a large war dog or a wild dog, hence it's often referred to as a devil dog. The precise form varies from creature to creature. They attack dependent on their form, so they use weapons if they're in goblin forms, obviously claws and bites if they're in hound form. They have pretty much the same spells that they can use with a few changes. They've got shape change into either of the two forms, levitate, misdirection, project image. They can do the following once a day: charm, dimension door, and emotion. So pretty much just the same, but some of the spells have been renamed in this edition. When they're in canine form, they can move at double their normal movement rate, and they pass without trace as per the spell at will, so they don't leave footprints behind them or anything like that. They're native to Gehenna and tend to live in isolation. Each Barghest has its own stronghold and force of servitors, over which it rules despotically over. Goblins recognise and worship them, but other races find them to be virtually indistinguishable from goblins in their goblinoid form. Goblins will often go to great lengths to bring them suitable gifts and sacrifices. Barghests respond by slaying powerful enemies of the goblins, as well as gaining wealth for the goblins, because the goblins hoover up all the treasure from the victims the Barghests killed, which obviously it's there for them sweet, sweet energy levels, not for the treasure. Occasionally, a Barghest on Gehenna spawns a litter of 6 young, which are immediately sent to the prime material plane, as discussed previously, and they go around eating as many hit dice worth of things as they can until they're powerful enough, at which point they yoink it back to the plane of Gehenna to take their rightful place. And that works pretty much the same as you've just described, with 0 level people being worth half as much. We get a last little bit about the ecology of the Barghests, where it says they pass through several different stages in their life. As a whelp, it's a hunter and tracker consigned to the prime material plane. There it sort of gains combat experience, it grows in cunning and wisdom until it's ready to enter in the next stage, returning to Gehenna and becoming a leader. It's still a hunter, but now its tactics and its attitudes have shifted to take into account the sort of larger theatre of war rather than just its sort of personal hunting and slaying. So after that, I believe the Barghests next appeared in the D&D 3.5 Monster Manual. So why don't you tell us a bit about that, love?
So they're very, very similar to what we had in Second Ed, although we've not got anywhere near so much detail about their background or their motivations. They're almost quite bestial in my interpretation of them, from this being the first time I'd seen them.
Yeah. I can see they're still described as fiends, so they're still demons of a sort.
And I think it's also, the picture gives that impression. I think it's actually supposed to be in between the goblin form and the wolf form.
Yeah, it's got that sort of
but it's,
halfway through transformation Wolfman deal like going on, you know. It's got the wolfen look to it, but its face looks a little bit more humanoid.
And it's got quite humanoid hands.
Yeah, definitely. It's a pretty cool picture, though.
It is. That's why I remembered it so clearly.
Obviously, they're going to have all the skills in the world because it's 3.5.
Yeah, but it's all exactly what you'd expect. Bluff, concentration, hide, intimidate, jump, listen, move silently, sense motive, spot.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something we see a lot in 3.5, and we've mentioned it a number of times in our previous episodes, whereas abilities, special abilities that have been defined by their own particular rules, like additions in sort of AD&D 2nd edition, will be folded into the sort of unified skill system of 3.5. And I know that was a big thing with that edition of the game, to try and bring everything around under that unified mechanic rather than sort of piecemeal creating like special rules for them. Whether you like that or not, down to your own particular taste, but that's what you're getting if you go for 3.5. So what does it say about the background in terms of these creatures? Does it give us anything extra in there, or...?
It really doesn't. We've got one paragraph which just describes them as being similar to goblins, and then turning bluish red and turning blue when they're fully grown. It talks about their eyes glowing orange. I don't know if I mentioned that. It is mentioned in the first edition as well.
Does it say anything about that whole deal where if they eat people they get more powerful?
It does. It's included in the combat section. So for every 8 hit dice or levels it consumes, it gains 1 hit dice. Feeding on the victim's body prevents it from being resurrected.
Okay.
And it lists what spells you might be able to use to resurrect someone. Mentions the alternate forms. And then we go on to the Greater Barghest, which is the big version, fully grown. And it's nice, I think, to have that, like, one as a small creature and then one as a fully grown one ready to go for when you get to your boss fight.
You've got that ready-made stat block, haven't you? So you don't have to do it all working.
Level it up in-game so much.
Yeah, it's definitely a handy thing to have.
So, what about 4th Ed? I'm guessing it looks like a Wargames manual.
Yeah, pretty much standard 4th Ed style stuff. They're described in 4th edition Monster Manual as savage goblin shapeshifters, so not demons or from Gehenna anymore, seemingly. They're actual goblins that can shapeshift. Barghests seek power and influence through violence and treachery. They can adopt the form of a variety of creatures, including bugbears, hobgoblins, and wolves. So that's a bit different from previous, because they were just these sort of fiendish creatures from Gehenna who could assume the form of a goblin or a sort of a wild dog, effectively. We have, as is the way with 4th edition, we have a couple of different stat blocks for different roles on the battlefield. We have the base level, which is the Barghest Savager. It lives for battle, it tries to incite bugbears, goblins and hobgoblins to violence, and often leads raiding parties in slaughter and pillage. And it doesn't specifically say a great deal about their sort of shape-shifting stuff here. We just get the fact they've got like an at-will ability where they can alter its physical form to appear as a wolf or a bugbear, and that works as in the change shape standard ability. They can do psychic damage when they feed on you. So in this one, instead of just like killing you and taking your experience levels to power themselves up, in this, when a Barghest feeds on someone, it can use an at-will power to effectively inflict psychic damage on someone. and that allows them to basically... It doesn't power them up in terms of gaining extra hit dice, but it sort of reactivates some of their powers that they've already used. So by feeding on people, they can effectively use more of their cool stuff more often. And we get a nice picture in here that shows a Barghest Savager in bugbear form and a wolf form, and it reminds me of, like, you know, the Mohawk Gremlin in the film Gremlins. So we've got this big bugbear, like a white stripe down its like shock of black hair, and then we've got the wolf form, which again has the white stripe down the middle of it. The next stat block we get is the Barghest Battle Lord, which, like 3rd edition, it's a more powerful version. This has a greatsword in its standard form rather than the battle axe that the Savager the Savager has. It can also do the psychic damage via a psychic howl, so it doesn't have to just feed on you. It can just, like, do a sort of Hound of the Baskerville style howl, which, like, chills you to the bone and does damage on you. It can heal itself by feeding on people, so it has a standard ability where it can do this, like, necrotic blast ability that inflicts ongoing 5 necrotic damage to someone. So once you've been hit by it, until you make a save every round, you're taking 5 necrotic damage. And whenever a person takes that ongoing damage, the Barghest Battle Lord regains 5 hit points. So if you blap that out at the start and loads of people fail the saves, they're taking damage each round. And not only are they getting weaker as their life's ebbing away, your Barghest's getting stronger. And it has the normal abilities for these sort of, like, the controller style of monster, where it can shift things around the battlefield.
So I can't help but notice that the pictures are clearly labelled as it being in its normal form and its wolf form.
Yeah.
And that these have got the, like, goblin face wolf, like we saw in the 3rd edit thing.
Yeah.
So they're no longer indistinguishable from large dogs.
Yes.
That's certainly a tactic that it's completely lost access to there.
Yeah,
Just
I mean...
interesting to notice.
I don't know how much of that is, like, actually in-game, because the shape change stuff changes you into the shape of whatever animal it is or whatever. But obviously, the people who did the artwork in this have clearly taken inspiration from the 3rd edition version. So the Battle Lord, which can assume the form of a wolf or a hobgoblin, again, it has the sort of Monster Mash style, like, wolf form with the slightly goblinoid face, but other than that, it looks like a normal sort of militaristic hobgoblin. We get a little section on Barghest lore, which says, although they're shapeshifters of the goblin race, so as we said, no longer fiends, they can also be found with other evil creatures. They're born at random amongst goblins who view it as a blessing from their patron deity, Bone. Barghests gain energy from feeding on their foes' will. Some steal powers, others use their foes' strength to heal their wounds. They have unusual features that indicate their special nature, even in goblin form. So a shock of white hair, so for instance the picture we mentioned earlier, or a discoloured eye. So they have like a tell almost, even when they're in the wolf form, which, as you were saying, makes them more obvious, even if they've not got the big sort of spongy goblin face when they're in wolf form. So that's 4th edition. And they next appeared in Volo's Guide to Monsters for 5th edition D&D. I see you've got that there, love. So what does it say about them in Volo? But before we go on to 5th edition, I'm wondering, has this creature in 5th edition managed to avoid the standard 5th edition trap that we've talked about, where everything has to be vastly overblown and mythic and associated with the gods? I'm sure it'll be fine in the Barghest of... Oh.
Long ago, Maglubiet, master of the goblinoid gods, bargained with the general of Gehenna for aid. I don't think it's going to be any better than that.
Yeah, I think it's time to... Don't get me wrong, if you like this sort of stuff, that's fine. For me, it does seem very much as though in 5th edition, like, that there's not really that many, like, just normal monsters, you know. Oh, the goblin shapeshifters or whatever. Everything has to be linked into some, like, ancient battle before time or the war amongst the gods. But anyway, enough for me, like, bantering on. What does it actually say about the Barghests?
It's quite lengthy and wordy. So this Maglubiet guy betrayed one of the generals of Gehenna, and the generals of Gehenna made the Barghests as, like, punishment. And then for some reason they have to eat goblin souls, specifically goblin souls, and specifically 17 of them.
Yeah, I believe it explains this, because for those who don't know, Maglubiet's one of the goblin deities, I believe, and it's supposed to be that Maglubiet betrayed as general of Gehenna and sort of reneged on a deal, and there were like 17 clauses in like the contract they betrayed or something.
Yeah,
so
the oaths Maglubiet broke in his compact totaled 17.
So that's why they come back and hunt goblins. It's like retribution for that, and 17 because like that's the magic number apparently.
Why are they suddenly only after goblins?
Because it's the goblin it's the goblin deity who betrayed the general of Gehenna. Why that was made as a design decision, I have absolutely no idea. Because that seems a bit silly to me to go like, this creature that like was just like after power levels, like power itself up, so you could use it in a lot of different scenarios. Well, now we're only really praise about goblins because, to be honest, your average hero, if you're like, there's some like devil dog like whooping its way through the goblin tribes in like Keleno, are you really going to be that bothered? I can't think of any situation where you'd be like, oh no, there's goblins who cause all untold trouble for civilised folk, or there's some like evil fiendish creature like tearing them up. Oh well.
I suppose it depends on how connected the goblins are into your campaign world.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you've got like a campaign where goblins are a playable race, or they're integrated with like the various other like demi-human races, then yes, it's perhaps a threat. But like in your standard D&D, which I would assume, given that they had a previous monster that could be used in many different ways, that you'd want to make this monster as usable as possible, where the decisions made in 5th edition just seem to like limit its use as far as I can see.
Yeah, so it doesn't gain hit points and get stronger in the same way.
Okay.
In fact, it doesn't seem to gain levels at all or improve itself in any way. There is a little box off about its soul feeding.
Yeah, so what does that do?
Well, it still destroys a player character if it manages to eat them in the same way that it has previously.
So they can't be resurrected.
Can't resurrect them. And it goes into a bit more detail about that, basically saying it takes at least 1 minute to destroy the body, and then the soul's trapped in it for 24 hours, so you can release their soul if you kill it within 24 hours. And that reduces their chance of revival by 50%. But it still doesn't actually gain anything from doing that in the way that it did previously, so it doesn't become stronger over the course of the adventure. It doesn't become stronger as it takes out parts of the party or kills down some of your NPCs.
Yeah, that is a bit strange. So what sort of abilities does it have then?
It's a shape changer. It's banished by fire. All in all, it's a much less interesting creature here as far as I can see.
Yeah, and I've got to say, going hand in hand with that, which, I mean, I'm a big fan of the Barghests. I really like this creature. But this version of it, like you say, just seems to be like the sort of like diet/caffeine-free version of it. And looking at the picture of it in its wolf form, again, we can see it's been clearly inspired by the 3rd ed version, but it looks shite.
See, this is something else. It actually describes that as its true form, and it says it can go from a small goblin into its true form.
Oh, so unlike
it doesn't specifically say that it's wolf-like anywhere.
Oh, so unlike in 2nd ed, where it was like, its true form is the goblin form and it can turn into a hound, now they're saying it's some weird sort of like monkey, vampire, bat, hound creature that can turn into a goblin. Mm-hmm. I suppose that makes a sort of sense, but that picture just looks goofy, and again, it seems like a much less interesting creature as a result of this, because it's just like, it's just some like big, vaguely wolfish thing that likes eating people, and it can turn into a goblin. That's pretty much it. Which
See, I'm not quite so down on the picture as you are, but I do think it's a shame it's got green eyes when it's been specifically noted to have like orange eyes several times previously.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the Barghest in D&D. I've been looking a little bit into the mythology of it, and in Northern English folklore, the Barghest or Barghest as it's sometimes called, is a monstrous black dog creature with large teeth and claws. We know from folklore that black dogs are sort of death omens or demons, depending on what legends you look at, that take the form of these spectral, shadowy hounds. It's believed by some people that the word ghost in Northern England was pronounced guest, and the origin is thought to be a combination of Barghests, which means town ghost. Others explain it as possibly being derived from the German Berggeist, mountain ghost, or Bargheist, bear ghost. And apparently there's another derivation that's possible, which is again from Germany, which is Bargheist, which is the spirit of a funeral bear. And I apologize if I've mispronounced any of those. My familiarity with the German language isn't so great. And most of these sort of black dog legends or sort of omens of death, they appear almost in like a banshee style. They appear and then some misfortune befalls the person who's seen it afterwards. And they're also, as a lot of these legends are, sort of mixed up with the idea of, are they a ghost, are they a demon, are they a hellhound, which sometimes they're associated with. And we see this sort of mix and jumble of legends throughout history, particularly in the UK, but I'm sure elsewhere as well. In mythology, they're generally described as being larger than a normal dog, having glowing eyes in some cases. Apparently, they're also associated with electrical storms and crossroads in some legends, places of execution, and other places that generally have like a spiritual significance or are associated with death.
So these are all the sort of in-between places,
yes,
places basically where, say, two planes might meet, and if like an entity had been spawned that was naturally spawned directly into the material plane, there'd be good places for them to pop up.
Yeah, and we can see that the D&D version has obviously been inspired by this, because they're referred to as devil dogs in some edition, obviously association with hellhounds. They've got this whole association with death, which in D&D is just because they're trying to like absorb the life energy, but obviously that's been inspired by the sort of black dogs of mythology.
But purely in game terms, your characters are walking across a crossroads and something pops out of another dimension.
Oh, yeah.
That's not such a far stretch to go.
Yeah, and the whole sort of fire thing, casting them back to Gehenna in D&D, that very much reminds me of I forget the exact description, but I think in like Hound of the Baskervilles by Conan Doyle, when they like scare the dog off, I'm pretty sure that's with fire, or the way it sort of turns around, there's like a flare of the sort of the luminescence, which obviously in the story is faked. It's like luminous paint or whatever, but there's this like flare. I can imagine if you banish this Barghests, there's like a flare of fire and it like disappears into this other dimension. So we're going to go on to one of the most famous black dogs in English folklore, Black Shuck, also sometimes known as Old Shuck or Old Shock. Name given to an East Anglian black dog, which is said to roam the coastline and countryside. It's one of the many black dogs recording on record, as we've just said, and descriptions of the creature's appearance and nature vary considerably. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the name Shuck derives from the Old English word shuka, meaning devil or fiend. So again, this link with sort of fiendish or devilish forces. And there's various descriptions of it throughout history. So I'm going to quote one here, which I found on Wikipedia, which is W.A. Dutt in his 1901 Highways and Byways features in East Anglia described it as:
he takes the form of a huge black dog and prowls along dark lanes and lonesome field footpaths, where, although his howling makes the hearer's blood run cold, his footfalls make no sound. You may know him at once should you see him. By his fiery eye he has but one, and that, like the Cyclops, is in the middle of its head. But such an encounter might bring you the worst of luck. It is even said that to meet him is to be warned that your death will occur before the end of the year. So you would do well to shut your eyes if you hear him howling. Shut them even if you are uncertain whether it is the dog fiend or the voice of the wind you hear. Should you never set eyes on our Norfolk snarly yow, you may perhaps doubt his existence, and, like other learned folk, tell us that his story is nothing but the old Scandinavian myth of the Black Hound of Odin, brought to us by the Vikings who long ago settled down on the Norfolk coast.
So there we are, again, an omen of death. We've got the distinctive sort of physical trait of the fiery eye, which has echoes in the Barghests in D&D, where it has this singular sort of tell in either of its forms, so you can identify it as like not being a normal dog or a normal goblin or whatever. And we've also got the fact that its footfalls make no sound, which is reflected in D&D by the fact it can pass without trace and doesn't leave any tracks behind it. Obviously, we've mentioned that it's connected with hellhounds, which are a variety of supernatural imps, demons and devils that for whatever reason tend to take the form of like dark hounds and fiery dogs and stuff like that. And I think I'd be remiss at this bit where we're just sort of like skimming the surface of folklore if I didn't mention one of my personal favourites, the Hounds of Tindalos, who are from Frank Belknap's Long's story, which was later incorporated into the Cthulhu mythos. And they're sort of vaguely hound-like creatures, although as is the way with Cthulhu mythos, they're too horrible to describe normally. But one of the interesting things about these, and what made me think about it as we were talking about dimensions intersecting and things appearing, is in that story, the Hound of Tindalos are said to inhabit the angles of time, whereas every other, and this is never really explained, but every other organism is thought to inhabit the curves of time. And as a result, it means that when these hounds hunt, they can appear out of anything that has like a sharp angle in it, so any corner of a room. And they manifest as like first smoke sort of pouring in from that corner of the room, then the hound emerges out of the smoke. So theoretically, you can stay out of the way of them if you made like a spherical room. And I believe someone does that in the story, if I remember correctly. But they basically just attack the outside of it until it dents it enough to make an angle, and then they just like come in on the inside. But the idea of these hounds is because they sort of hunt through time, they sort of like appear at various points through your history, getting closer and closer as they're like homing in on you. And obviously they emerge to get you. So again, it's the sort of death legend. So you might hear them when you're 15 or whatever, howling in the distance. And then every time you hear them or see them again afterwards, they're a little bit closer and they're a little bit closer. And it's basically them circling you, but they're doing it through time. So, one of my favourites, not strictly a ghost hound, a black dog or a devil hound in the same way, but it certainly has some similarities with the Barghests.
So, the story that the Barghests was reminding me of the most is Bigby Wolf's growing up story.
Oh, in Fables.
In Fables. Fables is a comic book series about fairy tale characters in... I was about to say modern day, but I suppose it's early 2000s.
In the before times when people could go outside.
And the character Bigby Wolf is later on a PI, but you get this fantastic... I can't remember where it is in the story. You get his tale of how he grew up and how he was the child of the North Wind and the Winter Wolf.
Yeah.
And then his mum dies and it's really bleak, and he makes this oath that every day he's going to get a little bit stronger, every day he's going to eat something a little bit bigger. And that's the part that was reminding me of the Barghest. And he starts on... You get the comic book montage panels, and day one he's eating a cricket, day two he's eating a mouse.
So he's absorbing the power, getting stronger.
Then on the final image he's eating a dragon.
Nice. Man, he was serious when it came to eating big stuff. But yeah, that is a good point actually, because it's that whole idea of which I know just doesn't exist in mythology to do with these creatures, but it's that whole sort of mythic idea of absorbing the power of a fallen foe, isn't it? To increase your own strength. But it would
also explain why a Barghest would go to the trouble of stalking heroes when it could just effectively farm villages and grind.
Yeah.
You know, it needs 8 hit dice of levels. It costs it 16 villages to get a hit dice. That's 128 villages. Yeah. That's a medium-sized village. All it's got to do is wipe out that one village. Now, maybe that's its plan and your heroes want to step in, but maybe it just wants to stalk your heroes for the credit so it can say, oh yeah, I got my 8 hit dice worth of power by killing one single, like, terrifying foe.
Yeah.
Where all you other lesser Barghests, you went out and had to, like, grind for hours and hours, killing all them crappy little villagers and getting barely any XP from them. I went and fought the boss.
So I also think as well there could be like a slightly, depending on which you prefer, there could be a slightly more mundane explanation for it. Because like, if as like a person in real life, if you've not eaten anything for like a few days, we know that like your stomach shrinks. Mm-hmm. So like if you've not eaten anything for days and you had like a normal sized plate of food, that might really fill you up. Whereas if you're like having that size meal like 3 times a day, you could eat that and it wouldn't fill you up. So I like to think that perhaps as the Barghests are eating more and more, it takes more to like assuage their hunger. So let's say the first time they did that, they killed like 10 villagers or whatever and they eat them. But then the next time they kill like 10 villagers, they're like, oh, it's not really filling me up a bit. So they're like, oh, I'll go and kill like these. I'll now go and kill like 10 level 1 adventurers. Oh, that's all right. That's sorted me out this time. Then they're like, oh, that's not really hitting the spot either. All right, okay, I've killed some more high-level adventurers. All right, okay, yeah, maybe now I need to like go on to ogres or whatever. And, you know, they gradually their hunger becomes more and more difficult to assuage. But like I said, there's a number of different ways you could approach it. So in terms of using the Barghests in your games, what do we think about that potential ways you could use the... I mean, like I said, I like the sort of Hound of Tindalos idea where perhaps you're being hunted by the Barghests. Mm-hmm. And I tell you what, it could be like quite an interesting thing because like the Barghest has a bit of a shape changer and it can influence people. In a lot of versions, it can project images and illusions. So it might only be able to look like a goblin, but if you can do illusions. So what if you're a group of adventurers and you've had like a sort of wealthy patron who's been sort of like encouraging you to do all these adventures and help out the locals, and you've been levelling up and you've been levelling up and levelling up. And what if your patron suddenly turns out to be a Barghest and he's effectively just been like fattening you up because he's like, I don't want you when you're like scrubby like level 0 bakers. However, if I put in the time and effort and I like raise you up to like be like 8th level adventurers, then it's yum yum bubblegum. So
effectively hero farming.
Yeah, because I mean, think about it. Like nowadays, when you get like people who are, they're sort of like slow rearing like various sort of like animals for consumption, like slow, like corn-fed geese and whatever, and they're sort of fattening them up, and they have like a longer period of time and a more sort of care and welfare put into them. But at the end of the day, they end up on the chopping block. Maybe the Barghests playing the long game, and it's like, okay, yeah, I've got to invest in this, and it's going to take a few years for those adventurers to get up to 8th level. And yeah, they might not all make it, but like, if they do, when it comes feeding time, I'm going to get them sweet hit dice. Now, obviously, the only problem with this is how you think your players would respond to that sort of betrayal of like an NPC at that sort of stage that they've got to know. Some players would be like down with that and it'd create like an instant villain, and you could maybe have the Barghest escape when they rumble him, and then you've got a ready-made villain for the rest of the campaign that they're invested in hating because like, oh, that guy played us for suckers for like 8 levels, now we're going to like get him back and like sort of like regain our honour or whatever. But some people might not be as fond of that. Obviously, you know your groups better than I do, so like, use your own discretion.
That's true.
I think, as we've said earlier as well, there's an intriguing sort of time clock or element on a Barghest. So you could start off with your players hearing vague rumours of a Barghest, and if they don't sort out the problem quickly, it's going to go worse.
And as always, I do like my isolated horror movie type scenarios.
Yeah.
So players rumble into a village, everybody's locking down because a couple of people have been killed. There's this horrible monster that's been seen out and about. And as you say, then you've got that ticking clock. They've got to, first of all, work out what the creature is.
Yep.
And then work out how to basically prevent it from getting at anyone. And I can't help but thinking of grabbers.
Oh, yeah.
where they just decide to have a lock-in to make sure that the monster can't get at any of the people.
Yeah. One thing I think is potentially interesting as well is there's a lot made about how Barghests are sort of worshipped by goblins, and they lurk amongst goblin tribes and whatever. And I know it said that dogs can always like identify them as like not being normal dogs, but what if you had like a Barghest who'd sort of taken over like a pack of wolves or something like that? So that could potentially be a different angle.
For that matter, you were talking about there being several of these sort of black dog stories about cities. What if it took over a stray dog pack in a city?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so that's about it for this episode on the Barghest, a goblin/wolf shapeshifter. We hope you've enjoyed it and it's given you some ideas. If you'd like to get in touch with us, maybe tell us how you've used Barghests in your game or any ideas you've got, then you can do so in a couple of different ways. You can leave us a message on SpeakPipe, there'll be a link in the description of this episode, or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and whatever you're playing, have fun.
Bye!
Barghest, the goblin/wolf shape. Wulp? Fuck a wulp.